Welcome back to the Daily Bible Reading Summary. Today, you should have read Genesis chapter 13, so let's go ahead and dive into this chapter and see what we can learn today. The text begins with Abram going up from Egypt. Now remember, he'd been kicked out of Egypt because he didn't tell the more important truth about Sarah being his wife rather than his half-sister. Now, did Abraham learn his lesson? I think if it had been me, I would have learned my lesson, and so I'm confident Abraham learned his, right? Well, we'll see about that. Moses now takes note of Abram's wealth. He was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold, and some of that came because of his trip down to Egypt. However, we should know that following God is no guarantee of earthly riches. It does guarantee something far better, however, and that is a relationship with God. And a relationship with God is exactly what God wants us to value. Abram returns to the place where he had made an altar at first near Bethel. The text says, "And there Abram called on the name of the Lord." Now, is this to say that after his failure in Egypt, he returns and calls on the name of the Lord again? Or is it simply to say that where he made the altar first is where he began to call on the name of the Lord? Well, the text is vague. Both can be true here. And it kind of does make sense that Abram would be sorry for his mistake. So as he returns to the altar, he renews his original devotion and relationship with God. Speaking of relationships, both Abram and Lot have so many possessions and livestock that the land can't support both of them. They also have the Canaanites and Perizzites living in the land, and so that probably also kind of crowded the water and grazing areas. More than that, the herdsmen of each are starting to quarrel amongst themselves. Abram doesn't want these problems to affect his relationship with Lot, so he takes the initiative. "Let there be no strife between you and me, between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen." Now notice his priority, relationship over rights. And then Abraham does something that he didn't have to do. But it also shows a step of growth in his faith. He gives Lot the first choice of where to go. "Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, I will go to the right. If you take the right hand, I will go to the left." As the older patriarch, it was Abram's right to choose, yet he didn't exercise it. Abram is beginning to realize, I think, that God is not just able to protect him, but he's able to cause him to prosper, even if the territory that he lives in is not as fertile as a different territory. Abram has now prioritized his relationship with God and with his neighbor, which in this case is Lot. Now, you'll remember from our reading in Matthew chapter 22 how important the love that maintains these relationships between God in the vertical and man in the horizontal is. All the law and the prophets rest on these two commandments, Jesus said. Here we see it being practiced by Abraham. Now, Lot does what many of us would do. He chooses the best land. The text says, "And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar." Before Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, it was an idyllic land, and Lot was sure he would prosper there. There was just one problem. The men of Sodom were wicked and great sinners against the Lord, the text says. Will this cause problems for Lot? Will this influence affect Lot? We will see. Moses now records that Lot settled amongst the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Notice the progression. He looked at the land, he chose the land, and now he's headed towards Sodom, even though he's not living in the city. He's not there yet anyway, but he's close, and he's moving in that direction. This is how compromise works. It's gradual. First we look, and then we move closer, and then we find ourselves living in it. After Lot leaves, the Lord speaks to Abram again. He tells him to look in all directions, north, south, east, west, and he promises to give all the land that he can see to him and to his offspring forever. This includes, of course, the direction that Lot went off towards. Now, God promises to make Abraham's offspring like the dust of the earth, basically without number. Now, this is the third time that God has given the land promise to Abraham since Genesis chapter 12. Each time the promise seems to get bigger. First, just this land, and then the land and blessings to the nations, and now all the land in every direction and descendants like the dust of the sea. God keeps reaffirming and expanding his promises. Abram then settles at the Oaks of Mamre near Hebron, and once there, he built an altar to the Lord. Again, worship. Abram's pattern is pretty consistent. Move to a new place, build an altar, call on the name of the Lord. Move, rinse, repeat. So that's Abraham as he's moving on and growing in his faith in this chapter. So let's see what we can learn from today's chapter. First, Abraham's faith is growing. To be sure, there will be setbacks to come. But in this moment, by letting Lot choose where to settle, Abram was trusting God to see him through no matter what. The God who created the heavens and the earth is able to make a desert bloom. Abram will be well taken care of. Fear not. For us, it's the same. God isn't promising earthly riches to us just because we follow him, but he is promising a relationship. And that's more valuable than all the wealth in the world. When this life is over and the universe ends, we will live on with God if, like Abram, we call on the name of the Lord. As Peter will preach in Acts chapter 2, those who call on the name of the Lord will be saved. Second, generosity and peacemaking matter to God. Abram said, "Let there be no strife between you and me, for we are kinsmen." He prioritized his relationship over his rights. He had the right to choose first as the older patriarch, but he gave it up in order to preserve peace with Lot. Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God," in Matthew chapter 5, verse 9. When there's conflict, are you willing to give up your rights in order to preserve the relationship? Or do you dig in and demand what's yours? Love sometimes does require that we give up something relatively small in favor of gaining something much more important. Third, we should beware of gradual compromise. Lot looked at Sodom and chose to move towards it. He pitched his tent in that direction, and eventually we'll see him living in the city itself in Genesis 19. The text specifically notes that the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. This seems to be a well-known fact. This was a red flag, but Lot moved towards them anyway. Compromise doesn't happen at once. Let me say that again. Compromise doesn't happen all at once. It's gradual over time. We look, we move closer, we get comfortable, and before we know it, we're deeply involved in it. We're living in it. Bad company does indeed rule good morals, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:33. Sometimes the easiest way to stay separate from bad influences is to simply not move towards them in the first place. And finally, God is faithful to his promises. Despite Abram's failure in Egypt, God still renews and expands the promise. The land, the descendants, the blessings are still on the table for Abraham because God's faithfulness doesn't depend on our perfection. Even when we fail, God remains faithful. That can give us great confidence, but it should also give us great humility. Confidence that God will keep his word, and yet the humility of knowing that we don't deserve it. Tomorrow we'll see another chapter in Lot's story and how God saves him through, well, yes, God's chosen, Abram. We'll also meet Melchizedek, one of the most mysterious men in all the Bible. One more chapter done, but with each day, we transform our lives by renewing our minds.